Hello and welcome to Enjoy the Wander. I'm Eunjee.
I'm Won Hee.
And we are here today with 7 Mile Road's very own Pastor Peter.
Thank you. I won't be here all week, but I'm glad to be here today.
We are so glad to have you here with us, Pastor Peter.
You can really just call me Peter. Like, you can really just call me Peter.
Okay. Peter is a pastor at 7 Mile Road in Houston, and that is not the church that Won Hee and I go to. We go to New Life Fellowship. And so we're excited to kind of have an authentic conversation with different churches coming together to just talk about how, faith, the church, and all things in between really play a core in Won Hee and I's most shared connection, which is faith, right? Mm-hmm. As a believer. Because this is kind of the first time some of us are officially meeting. So we're going to play a little quick game of connection. We're going to share 3 facts about each other. And then if you hear a connection, so you feel like, oh, I'm vibing with what Eunjee just said, or that's lame, right? If you say connection, when I say my 3 facts, then you go next and you share which fact you can connect with, and then you share your 3 facts. I don't know if Hua and Miss Chi would be proud of my instructions right now, but we're going to go with it. Okay. So our 3 facts that we are going to share is 1, what are you most thankful for in this past and still going on COVID season? What is a hobby? It could be old or new, but what is a hobby you have? And what is your go-to karaoke song? Audience members, I invite you to say connection in your heart as well.
In your heart, or in your car, or in your bedroom, wherever you are.
Primarily in your heart.
Obviously, everyone probably knows the answer to what I'm most thankful for. If you follow me at Eunjee Koller, you know that it is Jaden, my baby, who was born right at the start of this pandemic season. So I am thankful for Jaden. My newest hobby is thanks to @denali.market, as plugged many times before, which is ripping the cards, live breaks with Hidden Fates. And then my go-to karaoke song, if you've been with me, you know I gotta have it on. Brian McKnight, Back at One.
Connection. R&B, I wouldn't choose that song, but I'm vibing.
Oh, we vibing.
So I'm vibing.
Okay, so what are your 3 facts?
So I get to go next.
Mm-hmm.
Great. This is Peter, by the way, and I'm most thankful in this particular season for the fact that my wife is the best person I know. She is the perfect blend of compassionate to all and specifically passionate to serve and to love me. And that has rescued us from lots of pitfalls and places that I would have led us astray. And so really grateful for her. Her name is Kat. My hobby, old or new, I'm a person who's obsessed with listening to podcasts, which is great.
Wow.
I get to be on a podcast today.
Podcast Peter.
Yeah, that's right. I probably listen to 3 or 4 a day.
Oh, wow.
And so being on one now is kind of an odd yet amazing thing. So thanks for inviting me on, guys. Next one, karaoke song. Oh, how do I keep it PG here?
Pastor Peter.
That's right. I'll have to say it's got to be Usher, You Got It Bad. Anything on the Confessions album, though, the best album of all time, would also suffice. So that's
I don't recall that song. Can you give us a snippet?
I can't.
Okay.
I can't actually. Yeah, it's not allowed. It's contractually not
Oh.
Unfortunately, I don't have
connection. No
connection
vibes
to any of. Well,
You
I
listen
guess
to
I listen to podcasts.
Yeah. Just some sort of transitive property of some sort.
You're right. Okay, so I do have a connection to the hobby. I listen to podcasts a lot in the car on my way driving to different places. I think sometimes I get bored of listening to music, and so yeah, I've been listening to podcasts for a long time. So I'd like to say that I was on this train before the hype started. But anyway, I am thankful. I'm neither married nor have a child, so I cannot connect.
Can't vibe.
Can't vibe with those. But I am thankful this past season. I think just time to reflect. I think being in quarantine and being in COVID has just given us a lot of time to sit back, reflect, and really figure out like what's important, cut away a lot of distractions, I think. And so I'm thankful for that in this past season. Karaoke song. I'm a fan of Sugar by Maroon 5.
I don't know that one. Can you give me a snippet?
All you need to know is there's some falsetto parts that are very hard to hit for me, but just trying to get there, I think it's fun. So that is my go-to karaoke song.
What is your favorite podcast?
There's a podcast called Reply All. It's a podcast from the Gimlet network of podcasts. It talks about like internet culture, but they describe it as internet culture, but it's really not. It's about life and culture in general. And they just present stories in like a really interesting and fun way. So
it's a great answer.
I really thought it was
You really failed though.
Yes, that's exactly what I was waiting. Oh my gosh!
Pod is your favorite pod? That's okay.
Sorry,
Next time.
I messed up. I'm sorry.
I'm the shameless plugger of this duo.
I'm just a voice on this podcast.
Does anyone know Brian McKnight, or do you want to snip it? I'm just kidding. Let's continue. Okay. So all jokes aside, we're super thankful that you could be here on our podcast. And we want to say you're welcome for letting your podcast dreams come true. We are here today to talk about what it has looked like for you to be a pastor of the church during this time. Kind of, if you want to give a brief intro of like how you came into this calling and how it's kind of been, right? Like being a pastor and how you came to 7 Mile Road. And then since we are having you here for the COVID identity series, if you could talk about just like how that has been in like a elevator pitch, which is hard to do, I'm sure.
Please be sure to tell me, signal, or say something if I talk for too long. But I've known since probably the junior year of college at UT that I was being called, being prompted by the Spirit to get into church planting. And so that was not my hopes or part of my vision or dreams at all up to that point. And so it was a complete 180 from all of the ambitions that I had prior to that. But specifically at this particular church that I'm at now, my wife and I got to be a part of the planting team back in 2015. And this was because my mentor at the time, Jeremiah Morris, tapped us and asked us if we'd be willing to come join, be a part of this small cohort of people that would meet for a year and really start from the ground up to dream up what it could be like to start a church, plant a church, be the church that would see revival in the city of Houston. And so we are in the heart of the city. And over the past 4.5 years, I have left the corporate space to join as a pastor and now get to serve as the executive pastor of this church. But one of the beauties of my experiences in calling has been the fact that though everything within me has said no, and though time and again I've desired to pursue anything else, everything else, God has continued to proven to draw me in, continue to be what my mom would say, a yes man for Jesus, and has allowed me to see fruit upon fruit that in that first year of planning 7 Mile Road, we begged God every single week that we would get to witness and be a part of something that the Spirit could only get credit for. That no amount of strategy or planning or effort on our part could ever amount to what we would see. And God has been really faithful to answer that call. And so 7 Mile Road Houston is a non-denominational church that is a network of house churches. Over the past 4 years, we've multiplied into 34 house churches around the city. We have roughly 700 to 800 folks that would call 7 Mile Road their home. Some of our greatest wild, blue sky dreaming moments have actually panned out within these past few years. So we are asking God to kind of widen our gaze and to dream even bigger. And so that's kind of the journey that I've been on.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to see how you guys have really flourished as a community through serving with 7 Mile. And I would love to hear more specifically within this past season, how has it been with how God has really answered a lot of your prayers and constantly challenges you guys to dream bigger? How has that been in this specific time with COVID? Has that shifted any dreams you guys have for the church? Has that shifted any plans you guys have made because of how God has planted that in your heart? Like, how have you been wrestling with what you might have felt like was this direction, and almost maybe how God has shifted what that could look like because of what's been going on in this world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, like every other church and every other organization really in the world, felt like we were on the precipice of something grand, something really glorious to God. And it felt like we came to a screeching halt when March came around. And what we experienced was we just signed a long-term lease on a property that we have no business being in. It's way too large, way too expensive. It's so uniquely positioned in the heart of the city of Houston. But we prayed for over a year to land this and get it at a price that we could afford, that we could continue to give 50 cents of every dollar toward mission. And God aligned all of those things to be made possible. And so we were opening the doors, getting ready to kind of initiate this Kingdom Hub collaborative center in the city where we would house staffs of different church plants that were connected to nonprofits who are doing things in the city that we couldn't possibly hope to do on our own. And then COVID hits. And so as you could imagine, a lot of our aspirational dreams, just really, it felt like they evaporated into thin air. And we were planning to multiply probably a dozen more house churches. We had trainings all lined up. We had baptisms lined up, child dedications. And all of a sudden what we came to realize was that everything we had so thoroughly enjoyed and looked forward to became something more akin to like a distant memory. We couldn't get to do these things anymore. And so the ways that strategies have all changed, I would say the best way to phrase it is that we went from year-long to 5-year-long vision casting to just planning in sprints. We could only plan for 2 to 4 weeks ahead just because we didn't know what the landscape would turn into. And so based on the things that have happened in our city, we went stone cold, just virtual for months there at a time. And then now we've slowly been incorporating gatherings in house churches in a safe way outdoors, then to outdoor services. Now we're doing limited capacity, masks on. And so all of those things have shifted. And yet our strategies, how we think about strategy, has continued to stay in the format of sprints and not marathons. And that'll probably continue to be the case for the next however many years that COVID is still not just a storm that sweeps through, but a blizzard that really does affect how organizations think about things critically for years to come.
Wow, that imagery.
Wow. One thing I was curious about. So like, as I feel like, so you said you serve as the executive pastor for your church, right? And so like for me and Eunjee, like as church members, we don't really get to see what our pastors go through on a personal level of like, how do you handle COVID? How do you handle your own personal life? You have a family. And so from your perspective as like just a human being, as like a Christ follower, how have you been handling COVID? How have you been like thinking through what's been going on for you personally and in your own faith?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we'd love to hear y'all's responses to this question as well. I will say something that I actually mentioned to Eunjee some weeks ago is that this is the first time in my pastoral career where I've seriously doubted the call that God had given to me to be a pastor. When you kind of get into the thick of things, where being a pastor for me has always been, I get to do the thing that I love doing most, which is trying to honor God with the whole of my life by loving his people and catalyzing them to love their neighbors. Like that is what kind of gives breath into my lungs. And so once the relational aspect, felt like it disappeared overnight, where I was no longer a friend and a brother that could sit next to somebody in their living room or sit across from their dining table, to be able to put my hand on them while they're struggling and suffering, but to feel like we have to, at best, look at each other's faces over a screen or be on a call. It just felt disingenuous. And so everything that made me love pastoral ministry and love the church, it felt like it disappeared overnight. And so that's kind of what this year has been. Not only that, I feel comfortable sharing this. I feel like it's one of the reasons why I have maintained any semblance of health, is to be able to share honestly and transparently with people that I know that are caring enough to listen. My wife and I also had a miscarriage a couple of months ago. And so this semblance of, or this feeling of loss, the sentiment of losing things that we just so badly wanted, not only was it happening relationally with family and friends, but it was also happening even in the context of our own home, that to deal with grief like that, but to do it primarily just between the two of us in an 800 square foot apartment, that made it feel all the more isolating. And so I recognize that we're not alone in that, but that has made this season even more pointedly difficult. So all that to say, to answer your question, hopefully more directly and plainly, I think being a believer, being a follower of Jesus in the midst of COVID, I think things that other folks have kind of mentioned to you guys on this pod is that when you remove living life as a believer without community, side by side with embracing each other and going through all sorts of difficulty together, hand in hand, it really does feel like, this is why Jesus never meant for us to do this alone. This is why involvement and partnership with the local church is of utmost importance, because you will fail on your own. And so that's what it's felt like, that being on the brink of trying to still maintain that embracing of family within the church. But at the same time, that experiencing in a very different way with even my own home, it was hard to feel genuine even in my own skin, to do that for my community that I was called to lead. What has it been like for the two of you as active, engaged members of your church to try to live faithfully and with a lot of faith and hope in the midst of COVID?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I think I really resonated with what you said when it felt like everything just came to a screeching halt, back in March. I'm really involved in the youth group at our church. And so we were just coming off of it had been a few months after our winter retreat. It had been a lot of our youth group was really on fire after some of our summer mission trips. And then we were gearing up for really what 2020 was going to offer. We were just coming off of our senior trip, and a lot of our seniors had gone through a lot of really good things. And then literally the Sunday we come back from the senior trip was the Sunday where things shut down. We didn't have Sunday service that day. We had our youth service upstairs with 10, 15 people. But I think probably the biggest lesson that I've kind of been grappling with is one, how do we figure out how to reach out to folks during this time, a lot of our youth students have kind of gone dark. It's hard to reach out to them. We text them, we call them. Sometimes you get a response. Sometimes you start a text thread and then they just kind of ghost you for a little bit. And so there's that part of we want to make sure that our kids are doing well, but how do we do that in a place where we don't see them every week, where we don't see them at Youth House Church every week, or we see them over a computer screen where it's not as genuine, And so I think that is one question that's always kind of running through our minds, running through my mind. And I think the same goes for probably Ryan, our adult shepherd too, how does he reach out to us as his house church members? And the second thing that I've really been trying to process a lot is the balance between how much does COVID versus the fear of COVID affect us as people, right? Because obviously COVID is very real. It's very dangerous. It's not something that you just recklessly just keep living life the same way, But I do think for me personally, there have been moments where I'm am I scared to do this because of the risks of COVID, or just the fear that captures folks when they think about oh, what happens if this? What happens if this? What happens if that? It's just that balance between how do we live life responsibly and lovingly in a way that's not putting other people's life at risk? Even if I feel I'm safe, my actions have much more amplified effect on other people's life.
There's almost a natural veil that people have taken on that it once was for safety reasons, but now it's just out of habit. It's become habitual to say no instinctively. And so I feel so deep what you're saying that it's almost difficult to parse out even in our own hearts. Am I making the decision because I know it's the right decision, or am I making the decision because I've become so wired to respond this way all the time?
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. And I think the next layer of that is how do we responsibly encourage others, without acting out of pushing or acting out of hey, you need to get out there, because everyone has their own life circumstances, but as leaders or as people, we want to help others and help ourselves get into a place where we really are able to spiritually come back to life, even if we're physically safe, where's that balance between physical life and spiritual life? And I think that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and just the people that I've been talking to and in our youth group have really been trying to figure out the balance too. Yeah.
Well spoken, like a true leader. No, really. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. Eunjee, what are your thoughts?
I think what Won Hee's saying is even in our friendship, it's we've taken almost the opposite extremes, right? With when Jaden was born, which is my most thankful for this season, right? That when we went in, there weren't stay-at-home orders yet, and then when we came out of delivery, it was no, you stay-at-home orders are now fully in effect. And so I think it was so hard because I did not prepare. I'm not a great researcher, so we were definitely not prepared for post-delivery anything with Jaden. And I think that's a lot of, oh my gosh, I don't know this, I don't know that, I don't know that, and then put a pandemic on it. And I was not at all even thinking about that. Once this child is born, I went into huge panic. I don't know what will happen to this baby who has no immune system, and we are his full, we are the only thing he can depend on. And, a lot of, it's out of love. It's out of his grandparents want to see him. Right. And so then it's not even just about our health. It's also older people who are more susceptible to this, from what we hear, like way more susceptible to this COVID-19. And so then it's like, we have other people that are involved in this. And then, me always wanting to cater to other people, it was like, well, okay, then I won't do anything, or I won't, And so I think at first what was a out of love decision, which still is, right? But now it's also like where do we stand, where it has been 10 months and we are learning how to be responsible, yet be called as followers of Christ, and what that looks like in a loving way, and how to marry the two. And I think still right now it's been a struggle because, like Won Hee said in his, how do you lovingly encourage, right? He has lovingly encouraged us a lot too, but then sometimes we're just like, I don't know what that looks like. And so it's been difficult for us, and we're excited. I think that was not interesting. That was just, it consumed a lot. So I've just had a lot of anxieties I didn't know existed in my identity, I guess. And so those have all come out. And then at the same time, the other thing I've always wanted in Matt and my marriage is to like really grow in another level for the Lord and serving his kingdom together, which, we've done that well separately as individuals, but we've never seemed to like successfully do that together. And that was kind of like, oh, we're going to get to do this. And then COVID happened. So like, you almost can't do that in the way you want to, in the authentic way any of us want to. And so it's like you were saying, in terms of you experience these things, but then it's also isolating because it's really just in this home and it's really just with two people, or like those things. So I don't know, like even experiencing parenthood has been amazing, but it's also felt very lonely because we lived in a global world where people can fly, and like my girlfriends were going to get to see this, like my best girlfriends don't live in Texas, or different things like that. But it's like now it's with, you can't travel and you can't experience the joys with relationships you have because it's so limiting. And so, being such a relational person, this has just been a very, at the core, like confusing time.
Well, especially as a new mom, and I can't imagine it's especially those first handful of months, the anticipation that I'm going to have my parents with me at the gates, your best friends, meal trains. I'm going to get to see tons of people. They're going to see our baby. And then all of a sudden it's, now I can maybe see half of your face.
Yeah.
Or we can get on a FaceTime call, and just a drastic difference of what your expectations and what reality actually look like, that tragic gap in between living in that space. So that's tough.
As a pastor, like as you have kind of seen this pandemic progress over the 10 months, how do you feel like from your like leadership position in your church? What are kind of maybe like the different transitions you've seen your church members go through, and how have you tried to support whatever, that looks like? How have you kind of handled that situation?
Transitions. Well, let me think about that. I think everybody being just at least an aware person, with everything that's kind of happened in 2020, with everything from the pandemic to politics to things that are happening in the culture and society, I think everybody was at the beginning just wanting to take a moment to understand, to at least come to a conclusion, which I think is a really great place for people to stay a little longer than maybe they want to. What's happened over the course of over months now is that people have quickly transitioned into such firmly held convictions stemming from neither right nor wrong, but very personal opinions. That has kind of buoyed people to be at odds with one another and to build up barriers for one another that will exist for a long time unless they get addressed. And so what I would say is, in the context of our church specifically, some of the transitions even that I've been able to realize we have been going through while going through it is that I assumed we were all in a certain place, like that we were all at least to a certain degree of stacking hands on certain overarching beliefs. And what I came to realize is that one of the major transitions our church has had to go through is that we just had to recognize that we are a very diverse church in political leaning and how we receive various newsreels and how we respond to a global pandemic, that we are actually not stacking hands altogether on even general overarching things, which felt like in the moment that we were starting several steps back. But I've come to realize that this pandemic, this season, has just kind of exposed or revealed to us that there is a lot more opportunity to pursue unity than we ever thought we had before. For a long time, we thought we just need to become a more diverse, ethnically diverse church. We just need to become more of a generational diverse church. And yet what I've come to realize is that we actually just need to allow our diversity to actually be a beautiful melting pot within our church where we are willing to listen, to learn. And so one of the transitions that I'm seeing now and finding myself failing and leading in is how to navigate and help guide our people into actually having those conversations in a healthy way so that we can transition into experiencing life as God's church, as Christ's church in ways that he's always wanted for us. So I truly do believe that this season has helped us get further down the field in the context of unity specifically. Then it's almost like fast forwarded it for us. It's kind of put it into a blender for us, forcing us to have the conversations, to move forward in the things that maybe would have taken a lot longer.
I think I resonate with that a lot because I think if anything, like, I think I mentioned this like back at the beginning when I talked about what I was thankful for. Like, I think it's given a lot of people time to reflect, right? And think about like what's really important right now. And I think, like you said, it's kind of brought to light a lot of those things that may have in the past could have easily been like covered over by just the daily life and like going ons of the busyness of life. And then now it's like, it's just like, I feel like every time I look back on this past year of 2020, along with COVID and just like all the political stuff and all the racial equity issues that came up, it's just like, I feel like part of me felt like God was just like bringing these to our forefront and be like, hey, like you got to work through some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's so easy to just get swept away by what's happening in the day to day that like we don't pay attention. And
these things get swept under the rug.
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
process. Yeah.
In the midst of our talking, Eunjee's other half has jumped on the podcast.
Yes, I have a guest question. This is Matt Koller, the husband of Eunjee and the undefeated board game opponent of Won Hee.
Undefeated. I don't know about undefeated.
I do have so I kind of have a two-part question that I think is kind of important that follows up on what you've kind of been talking about. And I think one, I'm just curious to hear like, you being someone who I know, I'm also very good friends with Peter and I kind of know his heart and his personality, and you being a person with like strongly held personal convictions and your own, just like how you view the world and all those things. Like, how do you reconcile like your own strongly held beliefs in this time, like as a person, as an individual, and how you like view COVID and like racial disparities and even like the intersect between the two versus your responsibility as like a leader of a ministry of people and like fostering them and like loving them when a lot of people within that group might have differently held views than you and values than you hold. And then two, to kind of piggyback on question one would be the identity, I think, of people, kind of like you said, the identity in certain ways is being more like pushed into the forefront of people in this time. And I think even the identity of like a person who identifies himself as a Christian now has a wide range of what that looks like in this time, you know, not to say good or bad, but different. Like people who identify themselves as Christians view things differently, despite, you know, identifying in the same faith. And in this time where there's a lot of topics that have divided Christians, and I'm sure you see that a lot, even in your own ministry, how do you like push people towards, I guess, love and kindness when actions might be just like polar opposite of two people claiming like their own identity, like the same identity?
Yeah, no, those are really thoughtful questions.
Thank you.
Usually people don't say thank you to that.
That's right. That's when you just nod your head and smile at me on a digital pod. So to answer your first question, I think my role, not only as a pastor, but I think as a Christian, as someone who claims to try to live my life like Jesus, I think it is of the utmost importance that I actually have deeply held convictions. And like you had said earlier, I do. I have deeply held convictions about justice and about the injustices that are systemic in our society, particularly against Black and brown individuals. I have really deep-seated convictions about that. And at the very same time, it's also my role as a brother in Christ, as a leader in the life of Christ Church, to make sure that I understand personally what's the difference between something that is a major item that we need to stack hands on, and what is secondary and even tertiary that the Bible would say are secondary and tertiary issues. And so when I think about the Apostle Paul, and he's realizing that there are vast swaths of people within the life of the church who are disagreeing about, can we eat foods offered to idols? And like, do we have to hold certain days and festivals special the ways that the Jews used to? And he's looking at everybody who some people feel like that's a primary issue. Those are things that you should never do, because you eating food offered to an idol means you're an idolater. And what Paul is saying is idolatry is a primary sin that we need to stack hands on to say that is wrong. What he's saying, though, is that with food offered to idols, that being equated to idolatry, that is a secondary issue that you should have a conviction about, but you shouldn't be fighting your brother about. And so what I've realized my role is to try to help people draw the line between what is primary and what is secondary and even tertiary. And as we wade through those waters where people mix and commingle those things and they begin to bleed into each other, that some people believe that you have to vote a certain party to be a Christian, with the realization that that's not a primary thing. You can actually vote any of the parties out there, one of the two primarily, and still follow Jesus faithfully, obediently. And even though I have a strong conviction as to who you should have probably voted for in this last cycle, that doesn't mean that if you voted the other way that you are not an authentic and devoted follower of Jesus. And so I've had to recognize that and then help people realize that. So establishing and fostering this bond of peace, this mutual upbuilding, willing to love in spite of differences. I think that's my role as a pastor, and also as just a person who tries to follow Jesus' example. Well, so to answer your second question, I think in the context of COVID specifically, there are the loudest kind of 5%ers is what I call them. 5%ers on either end of the spectrum. One camp that says, if you wear a mask, you're living in fear. And we're called to be a people who live in faith. And anybody that tells you otherwise is being driven to despair by the enemy or by the world or by their sinful flesh. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a 5% of folks that will tell you, if you don't wear a mask everywhere, if you go anywhere in person, you don't have to go. If you meet friends, even outdoors, it is actually detrimental to the gospel message. That people in the world are seeing this and realizing that Christians are irresponsible and don't truly care about their neighbors. And when you hear those opposite ends of the spectrum, we come to realize that we are so deeply convicted that we have to be right. Therefore, other people have to be wrong. That we all of a sudden lose this sense of what does it truly mean to be a person of faith who follows after Jesus with the whole of our lives, which is to find the areas that we intersect and to love the world in the ways that God has called us to love the world. And so when I think about individuals who refuse to wear masks, for instance, that is one area that deeply hurts my heart, because it's like this perfect biblical example. Do not make your brother stumble. When Paul talks about that in Romans, to be so staunchly clinging to your opinion, to refuse to do the very thing that would actually make your brother comfortable around you, feel loved by you, and to refuse to do that because your opinion is so set in stone, is the opposite of the way that Jesus would call us to live. To live as if the other person is more important than ourselves, to die to self. And yet here we are claiming that no, self and our rights are most important. I think Christians, more than anything in the season, have to be willing to forego their rights. Like we have to, out of love, forego rights in order to reflect the best path, the right path to see Jesus more clearly. I think we have to be a people who are willing to give up our rights.
What would you say to the other 5%?
Who are so overly cautious and kind of damning the people in the 95% across, crushing them. What I would say there too is very similar, is a very similar message, that their demands of what it means to live well and right before God is unreasonable. That to condemn people for the ways that they are trying their best to live faithfully. I think what's easy to come to when all of your group chats are with the people that think just like you, who post the same Twitter feeds that you scroll through, who follow the same politicians and news media outlets that you love to read every message from. In that space, it feels like, no, we're right and the rest of the world is wrong. And so to that 5% that feels as though everyone out there claiming to love Jesus, yet having outings, inviting people over from their family to their house over the holidays, going to an indoor service, that is a damnable offense, I think is equally as wrong, as honestly as sinful. That it's a refusal to actually believe that the Spirit could actually lead people to have different opinions than you do, to have different convictions than you do on secondary and tertiary things. To kind of conclude this question, I think people have really lost what it means to trust other people. Instead, we have a disposition to distrust and mistrust. And so what that means is that people at the edges of the 5% of each other, because I do believe that the vast majority of believers are trying to wade through the middle of the 90%. I think that people on either end of the spectrum of the 5% are really looking across the way and saying, how dare they? How dare, I knew they were like that. I knew they would have voted that way. I knew they would have protested at that particular place, at that particular thing. And it just becomes this sweeping categorization where trust is lost. And so I would say we have to get back to a place where we can have long conversations where we're listening to people and coming to the recognition that people are trying their best to live faithfully and yet coming to different conclusions, which is the way that it's always been and the way that it always will be.
There was actually a survey. I can't remember the specific numbers, but the idea will get across. It was a simple question. They asked, I forget how many, but a large number of Americans, like, do you trust your neighbor to make safe and reasonable decisions? It was a very simple question. I'm going to make up the percentages, so let me preface that. But these aren't far from the truth. I don't remember the specific, but it was something like in the late 1900s. So, 30 years ago, it was 80% of people said yes. I trust my neighbor to make safe and sound decisions about whatever. And then recently they did, and it was 25% or something, incredible decrease. And wow. I think it speaks directly to kind of what you're saying and just how impossible it is to live in unity when that sort of distrust is there, just about how someone will live their life.
No, absolutely. What's interesting about that note, which I am not surprised by at all, is another statistic that 60 years ago, 90% of Americans knew their neighbors, everybody's name on the block, their stories would commingle, would be in each other's homes. Now it's less than 10% of people who even know their neighbors' names. And so the fact that we don't even truly know each other, it's making assumptions across the yard based on their picket signs, and based on the color of their skin, and based on where they're in their schools and what car they drive. It's all of a sudden we're making these assumptions because we don't truly know people. And so it doesn't surprise me that people actually have this innate sense of distrust because now we've gotten to a place in America where we don't even know people, really know people the way that we used to.
No. And last guest question. When did you pick up this phrase "stacking hands" that you use so frequently?
It's one of those.
I remember hearing that one in the past. It's as a growing preacher, growing in the sense that I'm still very much still learning what it means to preach well and effectively. It's almost some of those illustrations that I can vividly imagine in my mind that kind of can get easily incorporated into all of life. And so all the sports that we've played together, Matt, it's when we stack hands, we're agreeing, we're on this thing, we're doing this thing together. And I like it. As though I'm going to use it now. I was just curious.
If you do, just think of me every time,
I will have no choice but to. I don't know anyone else that uses the phrase.
There you go.
One kind of last question that I do have is, so as Christians, our greatest commandment or greatest commission is to go out and make disciples of all nations, right? And I know for both of our churches, reaching out to folks who don't know who Jesus is, don't know, who he is personally. Yeah. That's an important part of both our church's missions. But during this time, I feel there's an extra spotlight on what Christians do, right?
That's right.
You kind of mentioned earlier, Christian nationalism, people see that on the news a lot more. People see churches being shut down and saying, hey, you can't have worship in person, or people see people going to in-person service. That's and right. Why are they meeting together in large groups, right? And so there's a lot of visibility, I think, on the church and on Christians in general right now. But how have you been thinking about during this time as Christians, how do we continue to reach out?
Yeah.
To those folks who don't know who Jesus is?
That's a right question. It's something that I've implemented recently, just understanding the landscape that we're in. What are still some of the natural connections we have with people, especially folks who are near to us and yet far from God? And the people in my life that I realized that fits the bill for is I probably order 5 different meals a week from DoorDash. or I pick up food from a restaurant and take it home to my wife. And so what I've committed to do is that every single time that happens, anytime someone serves us food, anytime someone delivers me food, I let them know, hey, I'm about to go pray for this meal with this other person or with my wife. Is there anything that we could be praying for you about? And let me tell you the things that I've learned by just asking a simple question, to care enough just to pray, to offer people, let me just pray for you if that's okay. And to not put people in an awkward position, just to say, we're going to pray anyway. Thank you for delivering us food. Is there anything we can pray for you about? One anecdotal moment, there was a guy named Austin. He's from Nigeria. His immigration papers have been taking several months because of COVID. He delivered my food twice in the same week span. The second time he came back after sharing a lot of hard things, that his wife left him, that he's barely making ends meet, which is why she left him. And he doesn't know what jobs he can actually hold on to because of the immigration realities. The second time he came, he ran out of his car and he said, let me pray with you this time. And so he came up, masks on, into the office. Me and another one of our pastors who were meeting over lunch got to pray over him. He fell down to his knees and he started weeping because for the very first time, someone cared enough to just pray for him. And so that to me screams that people are desperate to be reached out to. And I think we just have to be creative enough to actually think of ways to care enough to pray, to have conversations. And so what I would say is, I think as believers, it is not our job to do things in the way that they've always been done. It is our role to figure out how to creatively and intentionally be light in dark places. And so I don't know what that means for you. I would be surprised if you don't get food delivered, if you don't get boba delivered to, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like we all have those natural interactions with people who are probably really far from God, but for moments at a time, really close and near to you. And so that's what I would recommend is figuring out where those intersections are in our lives.
Super helpful. Yeah. Thanks so much for that. Yeah. Cause I think I'm just reminded that like, it's not about what we see. It's not about like the things that we see broadly and things that we can't control. Right. But really like what's in our own direct lives. Like you feel like God is like pulling you towards or reaching out through you. So I think that was a really good reminder. Yeah.
And something that we learned away on our staff retreat a few months ago is that something that is true kind of, I feel as though sweeping around the nation in the church is that if your church is somehow navigating this well, like you're still giving and you're still pursuing right things, all of us felt like, we are living our values corporately. We are trying at least. But the moment we assessed our lives individually, we all had failing grades. And I think the danger in this year, in this season, in this space is to latch onto something that is happening that we're loosely connected to and say, we're doing enough right now. When the honest truth is, if Jesus were sitting down right next to us in that chair, what he would probably tell us is, no, I've got several next steps for you to take. You've got lots of interactions and engagement with people that you are not taking advantage of for my glory and for my name. And I think we've just settled to say, well, at least we have these loose connections where we're giving some dollars here. We're a part of that organization there. And we've just kind of made the excuse in this season. It's just not possible. When I think we're just fooling ourselves. We're getting failing grades individually and we're making excuses because it's happening maybe to a degree corporately.
Man, getting convicted right in the podcast.
Well, so I'm back and I just want to shout out, my boo for asking this stacking hands question because that was definitely on my mind,
Boy.
It's just kind of amazing to hear you share these things. And then I think one thing we did ask you beforehand was just like something you would want people to know. And I phrased it maybe poorly, right? But also I think it was good. It's like COVID identity, right? And you kind of preface like a response of, that's hard because COVID identity is almost clashing, right? One is hopefully temporal, right? And then the other is one you want to be resilient, you said, and like long lasting. So can you share more on that? Because that really resonated with me.
Yeah. I think it's what it reminded me of when you asked me initially the question to consider of a COVID identity. It reminded immediately of when people call people who are trying to follow Jesus who are practicing homosexuality. And we instinctively call them gay Christians or homosexual Christians, as if the homosexual or the gay is the true identifier. It is the sweeping thing that is true about them, and Christianity is just kind of something that they do. And I think in the same way, we're misplacing what our deepest, most longest lasting, what is supposed to be resilient identity is really the focus. And when we put COVID in front of it like that, we forget that COVID is going to be here and then it's going to leave.
Yeah.
And so who we are in spite of circumstances is the very thing that the Bible spends chapters and books trying to convince us of. You don't have to be dictated by your circumstances. Your identity and things that people identify you for can stay true and can still shine brightly, even amidst whatever will come before identity or Christian or believer or, and so that to me is why I think that what we have to get really good at. Otherwise, people will assume that they've been right all along, that Christians are hypocritical, they're frauds. When the going gets tough, they actually fail and their true colors come out, and those colors are really ugly. If we are the types of people who cling to the things that are absolutely true of us, and if we're not people who can speak those truths to each other to make sure that whatever comes before Christian or whatever comes, circumstantially in this season, if that dictates who we are, like we've lost it. Yeah. And the world is right. Yeah. And everything we've claimed to be about biblically, scripturally, gospel is wrong. Yeah. Anyway, so
I feel like that was something that probably a lot of us need to hear, right? Is like we've been clinging onto the identity during COVID. And I just really appreciate you breaking that into what it really is and how we've held that COVID part almost above the eternal part. Yeah. Okay. Well, before we close, I do want to make sure you were able to share everything you wanted to. We think these are ways where we can invite people we believe have wisdom, experience, and also insight. I just wanted to give you the last remaining words. Yeah,
I think something that is honestly really recently for me in the past few weeks got me to a place of health, of feeling like I'm actually thriving again in my walk with Jesus and in my role in the life of God's church, is the fact that I've had an opportunity time and again to have unfiltered, transparent conversations with people that are actually listening. People who care about me. And these are friends that are not just local, which I think is significant and important, but these are friends that I have across the country. One in Arkansas, one in Seattle, one in San Francisco. And all of a sudden, when people are actually willing to pause, to take the time to affirm the things that are true of you, to highlight the things that you're saying that are wrong, that are lies from the enemy or just wrongful thoughts or folly. If I feel the freedom and the safety to actually in an unfiltered way share what I feel right now in this moment before I patch it all together and neatly tie it in a bow and say, this is me. Don't worry. It was a few days ago, but today I'm great. But when it's happening in the moment at its rawest and worst, if I can do that, I've come to realize that that's going to actually promote real health. Yeah. And so in this season where I felt like I'm not fit to be a pastor, why would I keep trying to do something that I feel like I'm failing at? Why in God's name would I do something for less money and more time that puts more stress on my family and on my wife? Why would I choose these things if, XYZ things weren't happening anymore or true anymore? And if I wasn't having, again, these unfiltered, transparent conversations where people were willing to listen and could speak life back into the raw and the worst and the ugly, I wouldn't be where I am right now. And so I would have quit. I would have pressed eject. Anyway.
I see the eject. Great imagery, Peter. Well, I just want to thank you so much for this time. And I think that unfiltered transparency is so hard in the world where screen time is even more prevalent because of where we are right now, right? And so, I just want to end saying Won Hee, I'm so glad for this podcast where we can have these unfiltered conversations and have, these connections where you guys just met, but now we have this stacking of hands together.
Now we're vibing.
We're connections, guys.
We weren't vibing at the beginning, but now we're
on the same wavelength.
I just thank you a lot for coming and sharing words I really feel like God has placed in your heart and speaking powerfully to whoever's listening on the other end. I think we can definitely conclude together that our favorite podcast is now Enjoy the Wander.
Enjoy the wander.
Sure. Yeah.
Favorite. Won Hee, right? You
Yeah.
gotta say yes.
Sure. Yes.
Should we stack hands? Like literally?
I've been like, when I talk, I get really sweaty, so I wouldn't want to stack hands right now.
Hey,
Just
so
unfiltered
mingling.
transparency, guys.
And it's still COVID. We shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that was really encouraging for me is I'm always curious to see like how other pastors, other churches, other Christians are like walking through this time, because I'm so like involved and like not heads down, but just like, you know, I get like focused where I am, you know, and so I think hearing your perspective and hearing just like the things that you've been walking through, I think has been really helpful for me too. So very thankful that you were willing to transparently share all these things.
No, I'm super grateful for the opportunity. Really appreciate you guys asking me to be here.
And hopefully more to come.
Hopefully more to come.
Today was Pastor Peter. Next time might just be podcast Peter. Okay. Well, we're excited for you to get to the end of this episode, and we hope that you were fully able to enjoy the wander. Oni, no vibing.
I'm not vibing anymore.
It's gonna be my shtick.
I know.
A drop in the ocean, a change in the weather. I was praying that you and me might end up together.